Now, Monash IVF has settled a landmark class action involving more than 700 former patients for $56 million. The fertility group is accused of using inaccurate genetic testing and destroying potentially viable embryos. The testing was touted as world-first screening technology. The class action claimed 35% of embryos found to be abnormal were actually false positives. The company has made no admission of liability but says it regrets any distress or hurt that may have been experienced.
No amount of money will ever properly undo the harm suffered by our group members. Some people will never have the chance to have a child because their embryos were destroyed.
Danielle Bopping is one of the affected Monash IVF patients and a lead plaintiff in this case. Danielle, world-class screening technology. How was this additional genetic test sold to you?
Hi, Waleed. Look, as part of my fertility journey, I had one embryo left, and after multiple failed attempts, the representations of Monash really suggested that this was the latest in technology to determine whether or not a pregnancy may be viable. It was cutting edge, it was effective, and it really convinced me that this was the best way to go.
Did you have a sense that there was any potential error in the process?
Absolutely none. I was given some material to read. I had conversations with my specialist, and all of the information I was provided really convinced me that this was a good option. I always felt like I had been quite diligent in my IVF journey in terms of researching and doing due diligence, and I felt that I was really making the right decision in this case.
So Danielle, after the test, when you were told that your last embryo was non-viable, how did you feel when you found out that that may actually not be the case?
It was quite devastating, and I began a process of grief and grieving. The result of that test made me believe that I was going to be unable to produce a viable embryo that was genetically mine. And it was about a year later that when I was informed by Monash that, in fact, perhaps the testing was not as accurate as had been sold. And I was in shock. I was angry. I was hurt. I was confused. It was and it still is a very difficult thing to process, of how this could have gone so horribly wrong through no fault of mine.
Danielle, the grief's interesting, isn't it? Having been through fertility treatment myself, I feel when I think back to that time that there are layers of grief. There is grief initially that about the infertility, there's grief of having to go through IVF, there's grief then of when you produce embryos, maybe you haven't produced enough, there's grief, you know, you talk about going through the procedure and, you know, an embryo is implanted and you don't come out with a pregnancy, there's grief if you do lose your pregnancy. To have this grief overlaid, does Monash's expression of regret, is that enough?
You're right, Liz. Everyone's experience of IVF is different, and also their experience of grief and those different layers of grief is really different. It has been a little bit like continually scratching the top off a sore. We just keep reopening the wound. The grief is real, and I kind of describe it. It's a little bit like having an illness that nobody sees, not many understand, few recognise, and many fail to acknowledge. So I'm lucky that I have the support of my family and my friends, and there's different ways that we approach grief, and there's intuitive grief, and then there's the type of grief where we take action and we want to do something, and so that's what we've done.
Danielle, do you feel like this whole process may have cost you that opportunity to have children?
Georgie, that's pretty, yes, I guess is the answer. As a 40-something-year-old, when I got the news that the embryo was non-viable, but then another year before I was informed that actually it may have been viable, I think that would have changed my approach to continuing to pursue the dream of becoming a parent. But as a woman who was already in her early 40s, a year may not seem like much, but it's huge to someone who is already in their 40s in terms of fertility. Additionally, I think my trust was shot when I got the news that actually, the testing may have been inaccurate. I no longer trusted myself to make a decision about how I wanted to proceed. I no longer trust the medical professionals and the IVF specialists who we put all of our trust and hope and faith and our dreams invested into. And it's really been a bit of a paralysis in terms of how I move forward and pursue the possibility of becoming a parent.
Danielle, it's quite an experience and quite a day, I imagine, one of kind of conflicting emotions. We really value that you're prepared to speak to us at a moment like this. I know it's not easy, so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.